All right. Greetings, everyone. Um, we're missing our third panelist right now. We're hoping that it's just a short delay, but we're going to talk about this book no matter what. So I want to introduce first who we have with us today. Um, we have Dr. Jessica Kenyatta Walker, an assistant professor of Afro-American and African Studies, an associate professor of culture, American culture at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. Walker's fields of studies include feminist theory and culture and critical food studies. I believe there's a manuscript called "Her Kitchen is the World." Black women and the culture of soul food, traces construction of soul food using cookbooks, the USDA reports TV and film. And the project conceptualizes soul food as the battleground for Black representation in pop culture. To our delight, our Detroit Public Library's African American book list is called Beyond the Kitchen: The Culinary Legacy of African Americans. And it's the 2023 African American book list. If you are not here in Detroit, please feel free to go to the yes, to the website and click the link, and you can see it virtually. You can read it virtually. So it's fantastic. So I also want to let you know, I think I mentioned before, but I'll just let you know that the questions can go in the Q&A, or you can put them in the chat. We can catch them there. And we're also going to have a little Q&A. And if you need closed caption, it's right under there. This event, it's hosted in the Black Food Series. It's hosted by Source Booksellers, a nonfiction niche bookstore in Detroit, Michigan. And we are so happy to be celebrating and talking about white burgers, Black cash, fast food, from Black exclusion to Black exploitation. We would be overjoyed if our author would join us. And I will introduce Naoyo anyway, because she's the author of the book and will join us as soon as she can. So Naoyo Koite is an interdisciplinary social scientist, a Chicago native, and currently is associate professor of the Africana Studies and Human Ecology at Rutgers University. She is the author of Burgers in Blackface: Anti-Black Restaurants Then and Now, the editor of The Street, a photographic field guide to an American inequality. She's currently writing a book investigating the impact of corner liquor stores on Black urban life. You can find out a little bit more about this book and about what's going on with her research at whiteburgersblackcash.com. So we want to spend the hour that we've asked everyone to have really wisely. So how do you do, Dr. Walker?
Hi, Allison. I'm well. Thank you for inviting me to the panel. We really do hope that Dr. Koite is okay and doing well. The good thing is, though, that she has gifted us with a really amazing book and a really a cool and neat book. So I'm happy to jump in at whatever point. I could talk about this all day.
Okay. So I think your first sort of encounter with her writing was in your teaching, correct?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, Burgers and Blackface, her first book. And these are it's one of the questions I wanted to ask. You know, the first and second book, what's the relationship to it? But Burgers and Blackface is a great book. It's a short read, it's accessible, and it talks about anti-racist restaurants. And so these are things that we might think are in the past. So one of the most infamous ones is called Coon Chicken Inn. And if you can imagine, the edifice of this restaurant is essentially this Sambo-like figure, this black man in blackface, and you enter in through his mouth. And from there, you're greeted with a host of images, grotesque stereotypes of African Americans on your, plate, on your placemat, on the walls, everywhere, right? And dealing with this really interesting idea, right? On the one hand, there are African Americans who work in these restaurants. And the restaurants in some way usually have some very explicit, grotesque stereotype of African Americans. So they work there. And one of the workers is famous as saying, I'm laughing all the way to the bank. They're laughing at me, they're laughing at, the restaurant, but I'm laughing all the way to the bank. And the second part is how the book traces how these restaurants had a lot of staying power, like into the 80s. Some of them are still around. I think Coon Chicken Inn, there might be still one in Pacific Northwest. Certainly, there's one of a Mammy's Cupboard, I believe it's called, which is still around and still a tourist attraction. So she's saying, like, we think they're part of the past. I think they had nothing to do with America. And very similar to this book on fast food, they've got a lot to do with America, both the conflicts of that Black server who was trying to make a living, trying to negotiate between the stereotypes and making a living, and also this white perception and desire for these images. And so that is a really good book to teach to students, to realize that her argument around racism and anti-racism, especially in our food system, is that it's not just about access, but it's about these restaurants as well and the culture of the restaurant.
Definitely. I want to read a little bit of what Bryant Terry, the cookbook writer, James Beard Award-winning cookbook writer, wrote about this book. It said, white burgers, black cash comes crushing through everything you thought you knew about fast food to land as a definitive history of how the industry has become so entrenched in the Black communities. Built on the staggering body of evidence, this riveting and accessible exploration of fast food's terrible racial transformation is necessary reading for everyone concerned, and about inequitable food environments, it is a masterpiece. So that is really why we wanted to talk about it. We know that we have a lot of fast food places in our neighborhoods, and we also know that there are some that are in other neighborhoods and not in our neighborhood. Which, is interesting to think about, prior to reading the book. But on the cover of the book, you see Burger King, KFC, and the one in the middle, I'm unfamiliar with, or maybe I am. No, it's just Popeyes.
I think it's a Title Tavern, which I think was like a local hamburger joint. Yeah.
Oh, okay. With the Title Tavern. So let's think about the beginning of the book, right? So the beginning is sort of like how it started, and then the end is how it got Black, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that's what I think, the book is from exclusion to exploitation. So those are the two big parts of the book. Maybe people will be surprised to know that the first and second generation fast food was really a white suburban phenomenon. And folks did a lot to not only keep Black perhaps franchise owners from owning the food, but also from keeping physical people, Black people, from entering the restaurant. And especially around suburban development. So that was something that I learned, that this first and second generation fast food, and we're not really talking about the national chains at that point either. So something that often gets left out in this fast food conversation is that there are local fast food chains that are really important to neighborhoods. And so there's this push and pull until the 60s and 70s between these local, Black owned fast food restaurants and these national chains. And so that's where it comes from. It's first you say exclusion, how we're excluded from the suburbs, literally from, owning houses or being in those neighborhoods, to then after the 60s and 70s, there's all of a sudden a rise in what? Black consumer money, that advertisers and marketers are saying, hey, wait a minute. I think that, if we switch a few things, that we could really benefit or exploit, in the words of Dr. Kwate, this phenomenon. And so that's what the book is kind of how it's organized. And to your point, one of the biggest takeaways from this book is really complicating that common sense notion where we attach Blackness to fast food in all the many ways we do. It's one of the most difficult things to teach my students, is to understand that that's not a natural connection. But when we say inner city ghetto fast food, we're signifying Blackness and African Americans. And so this is the first book to ask why that is. This is the very first book to ask why that, well, not the fair. Marsha Chatelain's Franchise is a really good compendium and pair with this, but they're some of the first two authors to ask that question, because they're not presuming that it's a natural association, or what reoccurs, the presumption that Black people have a natural taste and predilection for this food, which is simply not true and very complicated. So yeah, from exclusion to exploitation, it's that part one and part two, which is why I think Terry calls it a masterpiece, is because there's a really hefty contribution to that conversation.
So I want to just mention, when you mentioned the book Franchise, it was so misunderstood when it came out that there was like a feeling, or when they saw the cover, maybe they were thinking, oh, you're going to celebrate Black people who had franchises. And it's like, oh no, it's a history.
Yeah. It's history, and it's contested, and is contested in every step. Yeah,
definitely. The freedom of panic. That's freedom from panic. That's it. I'm sorry. Freedom from panic. The American myth. What was your takeaway from that?
Yeah, I think this is one of the chapters that kind of makes clear how fast food is very intent in every generation about defining what is whiteness and what is acceptable, what is healthy, what is modern. So you're really serving people in a space, in a suburban space that's supposed to be attractive, right? So these fast food restaurants are moving into the suburbs. And I believe Dr. Kwate is arguing that suburban idea gets transferred to fast food as a way to keep Black people out of the suburbs as well, right? So we have the actual spaces, the restaurants are becoming cleaner and whiter and more standardized. There's an aesthetic change. There is a targeted push towards gender, especially in women taking care of the home and selling fast food. Again, this might seem strange to the modern listener, but fast food was a really healthy and acceptable alternative to a well-cooked meal for the suburban housewife. So they're selling not only the fact that, you can shave off time in your cooking prep through the good, homemaker or housewife, but they're also trying to manage in these early days, as early as 1955, and we could probably even say earlier, the fear of obesity. So that's that freedom from panic, is that when health, obesity scares, and all this come up in the 50s, they're in the same breath of gender, house management, nation. There's a section on the Cold War, because we were holding up fast food as the pinnacle of American consumption. It was the opposite of how people were eating in the USSR, right? Famine, and you don't know where your next meal is coming from. So the fact that both national citizenship, how to be a progressive woman, housewife, and gender, how to maintain and manage your health, and also being a good source of a progressive family, were all these aspects of racial meaning that get applied to fast food in this kind of second half of the suburban push. And so saying, look, freedom from panic, all of that stuff that you heard about the inner city, tenement houses, crime, robberies, all these things that were associated with these kind of first generation fast food things, we've done away with that. This is the suburban idea, and you can buy into it. And the suburban idea is all about the freedom from that gendered, racialized, sexualized panic that's cropping up. And I believe that section also has something about like teenagers that, you know, people were afraid of loitering teenagers, right? All these different kinds of fears. And that's something that is done really throughout the book. How the federal government or local authorities, health department, all these entities, how they treat fast food is coded racially from the very beginning.
Is there a favorite part of the book for you?
I have to say, finding out who Popeyes was named after. So Popeyes, and finding out a lot about these national chain, like Colonel Sanders and him being like a aggressive, foul-mouthed drunk, and but the Popeyes was actually named after not the cartoon character, but a character from a film, I think Goodfellas, maybe, a racist cop named Popeye, who's nicknamed Popeye. And it was based off of a real person, a guy named Edwin, who was cited as starting riots in Harlem because of his mistreatment of Black residents during arrest. He was a well-known racist cop. And wow. Popeyes was named after him. So when, for those of us who study food and all this, people are like, well, is it about recipes and cookbooks? No, when you get into it, it's about how these
all this culture,
all the culture, but also the not so subtle ways that kind of race ends up in shaping our meaning of food every day. And that's one of those ways, right? It doesn't mean that Popeyes hasn't changed its meaning, but the fact that this original, and the guy who created it was from New Orleans, but he was raised in an all white neighborhood. He wasn't Creole. He didn't,
Wow.
So
well, how it's marketed, just think about how it's marketed today. There's chicken
Ann. Yeah.
Chicken Ann.
That's in it, Chicken Ann. Yeah. This Black woman, and even the voice you hear, love that chicken from Popeyes, all of that is coded. And so again, it's from exclusion to exploitation, right? That at many different points, especially with KFC and other goods, you're actually drawing from African-American food traditions, right? And but you're excluding that population. That was one of my favorite moments. I think another favorite moment was realizing that the federal housing guidelines that essentially protected redlining practices labeled Black people themselves as a nuisance. So when we roll around our neighborhoods, we look at someone's fence that isn't painted right, or grass that's overgrown as a nuisance or blight. But the people themselves were also categorized as that, right?
Wow.
And so I think that, between those two little interesting factoids, you can really see how fast food is what we call like a spatialization of race. That is the way that we see and understand race in the space around us. And so that was that. And a ton of sources used here as well. I mean, we're talking James Baldwin, Audre Lorde, restaurant guides, interview guides, historical maps, policy review. I mean, and I again wholeheartedly agree with Bryant Terry's assessment that this is really, you can see the work and the masterpiece that it is. But what was your favorite?
Well, I have to think about it. A lot of this was like just new information. Like I haven't studied a lot about it, but I didn't know anything about the Horn and Hardart.
Yeah.
I didn't know anything about that. I didn't know how long White Castle has been around.
The original.
um, for that. But I think the chapter that talks about the black exploitation
Yeah.
um really opened my eyes because I didn't um I didn't make those connections prior to reading the book about with food.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a really, um, I mean, again, one of the many ways that this is such an amazing book, right? We start with, a scene from Superfly, the Gordon Parks directed film, and we're like, well, where is
Hmm.
this? Every chapter
Where
starts
is
with,
this going?
now where are we going with this one? Right. It is in a brilliant way, right? Again, we're starting with that. Um, and making the observation that some of these scenes are shot in fast food, right, restaurants, specifically the Kennedy Fried Chicken, which is this
Hmm.
very specific, like Harlem fried chicken joints. Um, and making us aware that, okay, so how do we get from that to fast food? Well, blaxploitation as a genre actually comes up when Hollywood is suffering dearly. Their big blockbuster movies are not making money, people are losing money, but what they do see is that in Black neighborhoods where there has been white flight, there are all these theaters, and Black people are starting
Hmm.
to fill those theaters in mass. And so what Hollywood does is this little pivot toward, right, producing these blaxploitation films because they
Quotation.
see a dearth elsewhere. And so the connection to fast food is to make an argument that the fast food industry in the 70s is doing a similar thing, right? They're saying that there's a shrinking customer base and we got to move to the city, right? And so then begins this period of fast food exploitation and how people kind of manage that, right? So they were no longer as those previous first and second generation fast food folks in the 40s and 50s. They weren't kind of an afterthought of marketing and advertising. Now they're at the
Hmm.
center of it. And now we see in our Ebony magazines and our Jet magazines, right, explicit advertisements, because we're
Hmm.
also seeing African Americans enter those professions as well. And so she's
You
really
mean? Do you mean it? Do you mean as franchise people?
as franchisees or as just working at Ebony and people who
Oh,
are
I see what you
marketing
mean.
and advertising for national chains. Um, Something else I didn't quite realize is that a lot of these national chains are getting bought up by processed food like corporations, which makes a lot of sense. That
Hmm.
Pillsbury bought Burger King in like 1970 something, and General Foods bought, and you're like, yeah, that makes sense because they're the same food, but not knowing, right, that there's this really this real structure and legacy of exploitation is really fascinating. So yeah, that was one of the, I think, more interesting chapters, definitely making those connections. But that's what the book does beautifully. It connects the
Hmm.
kind of cultural moment to what's going on in fast food, right? Because of course, how do we understand fast food without advertisement, without marketing, especially after the 1970s and 60s?
Yep. And so one of my experiences, for some reason, I thought Arby's went out of business because I couldn't see
Couldn't
any
see
in
him. Yeah.
Detroit, right? But
Yeah.
when you leave the suburbs, there are
Yeah.
like Arby's. Oh, did you? Oh my goodness. We love
Time
seeing your
zone.
face,
Time zone.
Dr. Quinn.
Was it the time zone?
I absolutely thought it was on Central Time.
Oh,
Yep.
you know what? We mentioned that.
Yeah. Because I saw your email said you're in Chicago. It's good to see you. Good to know you're
It's
well.
good to see you.
Unbelievable. I'm so sorry.
That's
No
okay. We
worries.
want to thank everybody for sticking in here, and I'll go away. So we did the introductions earlier, and then we were talking about your book.
Okay. The book of the absentee author. Yes.
Praise.
So
Give me praise.
so everyone we have with us, we're very happy and excited. The author of White Burgers, Black Cash, Na Oyo Kate, and we are, and I'm just going to step away and let Dr. Walker and Dr. Kate talk about the book. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi. So we were just talking about the Blaxploitation chapter.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And I don't know where you want to start. Maybe with we started with the first book and this book, and maybe just how you got from the first to the second, the relationship between the two, or where this came from. I know you have a public health background, so I think that's really essential to this book's contribution. So,
thank you, and again, apologies for being late. So really, what happened with the genesis, well, of both books is that, so I'm a psychologist by training. And I actually came to public health after having done clinical training in large New York City hospitals where, I was training to do clinical psychology, working with a patient population in public hospitals, and just really being struck by the burden of chronic illness, which was egregious. And these are Black and Brown patients. I was working with children and adolescents and their families. And the burden of illness was really startling. And that's what, so this is during my, doctoral training. And so that's what sort of led me to this path of public health, because I really was interested in trying to understand, how people came to be sick in the first place, and really expanding the scope from purely mental health to health more broadly. And so I was really, interested in like how, you could see the material, consequences of or features of the neighborhood, how that played into health. And there was a lot more that, clinical psychology, which is really focused on intrapsychic processes, doesn't address. And so I, began moving to try to expand the locus of my research from purely cognitive and emotional to, a neighborhood context, social determinants. So one of the things I did was, so I started becoming really interested in the built environment. And one of the early studies was looking at the distribution of fast food restaurants in New York City. And so living in New York at the time, you could see quite plainly the kinds of disparities in what was in neighborhoods and what wasn't, and the disproportionality of fast food was clearly one of them. So with some colleagues, we conducted an empirical study where we looked at the distribution of restaurants, and the percentage of Black residents was the biggest predictor by far of where fast food was. So the more Black residents there were, the more fast food there was. And it wasn't about income. Income was basically, a flat line. There was no real relationship. And so when you look at race, after you account for income, after you account for population density, all these other factors, Blackness, the percent Black was really the strongest factor. So that led me to the book, because I was really struck by that. And it just really was a question of, so how did this come to pass? Where, I hadn't studied fast food's history at that time, but I knew enough that it was very white when it began. And so how did we come from this super white beginning to being virtually synonymous with Black space? And so that's what led me to the project, and really just trying to trace that history of, how it changed and what were the determining kinds of factors in that. And so while I was researching, so I it feels like I'd been working on this book forever, but really because, the paper we published was 2009. And so, I kind of started thinking about it, but wasn't able to really get into it at that time because I had other projects going on and so on. So I kind of in fits and starts would be doing little pieces of things, thinking about it. Then I had a big study going, the Black Life study, when I moved to Rutgers. And I just didn't, it was always something sort of percolating in the back of my mind, but I couldn't really give it full attention. So it wasn't really until like 2015, 2016 that I got for real about it. I had gotten a fellowship from the Smithsonian, and actually just the summer before from the Black Metropolis Research Consortium at the University of Chicago. So those gave me some funding, some time, and that's when I got real about it. So then while I was beginning the research for the project, there was a point where, so I was at the Chicago Public Library, and I was literally just paging through old yellow pages, just old, phone directories, because I was trying to get addresses of where restaurants were, because I wanted to map them in space. Where were they in 1950, 1960, 1970? Like, what neighborhoods were they targeting, and so on. So while I was just browsing through these restaurant listings, I came across some restaurants that I didn't know, one of which was Richard's Restaurant and Slave Market, which just, what is this? And this is in the suburbs of Chicago, and this is 1960 something. It's not 1860 something. What is a restaurant with slave market in the name? What is this? Okay, so I sort of, filed that away and kept doing what I was doing. And then I came across, when I was at the Smithsonian, they have the Coon Chicken Inn restaurant archives. So there's a restaurant called the Coon Chicken Inn. And so now there were two. And then I came across Mammy's Cupboard, which is still operating in Natchez, Mississippi. And at this point I was like, okay, so now I have to write something about this. Like I wasn't, that wasn't the goal initially. So it just sort of developed as an offshoot of the main project. So I took a little detour, did that research, wrote that little mini book, and then continued with what I was doing with the main one.
Yeah, I think that journey is so clear. It's a deeply researched, of course, but interdisciplinary. I mean, I was talking before, there's James Baldwin, Audre Lorde, restaurant guides, and, the strengths of the first book and this book as well. And this is, I think, Allison read a quote from Bryant Terry that called it a masterpiece, but it's this meticulous literally mapping of how racial meaning has changed throughout time and breaking up our common sense associations, and breaking through also the discourse of the obesity epidemic and those fears as well. So it fits a gap that I don't think most people knew they needed to know about, but the presumption that these are natural linkages between Blackness, ghettoized space, and poor food, be it the national or local chain, is so important. I was wondering if you could talk about one of the most interesting examples to me, or one of the kind of, this is something a phrase I'm going to use, the government burger, right? We're all from government cheese, but if you could talk a little bit about what is the government burger, as one of those examples of how racial meaning around fast food has changed.
Yeah, so government burgers, that's really dealing with the ways in which the federal government actually played a direct role in the proliferation of fast food in Black neighborhoods. So there were multiple forces happening, multiple things at work, but one of them was, in fact, financing from the federal government. So this begins in the late 60s, actually mid to late 60s, and where the government, was concerned about the urban unrest that was brewing or exploding in many US cities. Watson 65, Detroit 67, many cities, and 68 following the assassination of Martin Luther King, and so on. So they really, under Nixon, there were different agencies in the federal government, the Small Business Administration being the primary one, that started trying to increase what they were calling minority, business enterprise. And the idea is sort of being, well, okay, if there's all of this unrest and the natives are restless, we can give them these businesses which will help to quell, the unrest and the tamp down on the uprisings that we're seeing, and which, okay, obviously in itself is a flawed premise because that's not what anybody was asking for. And again, many of those uprisings have a starting point of police brutality, very similar to today. So those things are not going to be fixed by giving people businesses. That's missing the point. Much less fried chicken businesses. Like, it's sort of, when you think about it that way, when it's that literal of, well, we'll just give them some fried chicken and that might help. But the problem was, like, so the turn to business and the turn to the market and business enterprise as a way to fix everything was also flawed because the approach was to look to franchising, which was really gaining steam at that time. And the idea being, well, if you are buying into a franchise, this is not as difficult as starting your own business from scratch, right? So you're buying into a corporate name that has name recognition. You have supposedly all of this training behind you. You have, all the support from corporate. and all of these things that are supposed, so the risk is minimized. And you can see it, in Ebony and other places, industry magazines, but there's a lot of sort of discourse around the franchise as like this risk-free, you don't have to know anything, and you can just come in and work your way to riches. And so the government was very interested in financing franchising because the idea was that a franchise business was less risky for the investor as well. So that if the government is, if the SBA is backing loans for a business in franchising, it's not the same as some mom and pop restaurant that somebody's trying to start from scratch. So if you buy, if you're a McDonald's franchisee, we feel confident that you'll be okay. The reality is that, of course, just because you're buying into a franchise, the rest of the racism that you're going to deal with doesn't go away. So, franchisees or potential franchisees who need to go get a bank loan, they still can't get a loan. And also even the racism within corporate entities, like within the restaurant chains, a lot of the restaurants they were giving the most sort of problematic locations to Black franchisees. They were redlining them out of white neighborhoods and highly profitable outlets. So there was there were instances. McDonald's had what they called a zebra partnership, which was where they had a Black franchisee but backed by a white investor, and those went south because the white investors basically ended up pillaging the franchisee for their funds. So there was always problems, and the franchise model wasn't going to solve. And indeed, some of the people who were working on the task forces to promote minority enterprise were themselves from fast food. So it's not surprising that that's what the government, went on when their own task force was comprised of people in the industry. So, so that chapter is just really trying to deal with the capital infusion, but that also that put franchising at the forefront, and which also meant that was to the detriment of any number of things that could have been bolstered with that much federal money. It's not like they were funding arts programming and whatever else, but you ended up with a string of chicken shacks and whatever. So that's what government burgers is dealing with.
Thank you for that. And I love the phrase racial Xanax, which I believe shows up as a way to explain how it's given as kind of a sedative and really an excuse for other forms of neglect. So I have lots of questions that could go on all day, but I do want to make sure I get, for those folks who are here, if you have any more questions, please place them in the Q&A. And I'll ask this question from Janet, actually. She says, thank you for talking about this book, even without, you're present. So talk about the history of publishing books on Black foodways, the Black farmers, and the growth of interest in eating healthy foods, which kind of relates to a question I had. We're from exclusion to exploitation. Mm-hmm. Is there a third thing? Like, where are we headed? I'm thinking of places like Slutty Vegan and these kind of interesting collaborations between a model and a different kind of food. So can you talk about that? Where are we going in terms of the growth of interest in health, broadly defined, really?
That's a great question. I'm not sure. I think it's interesting because, so in the book, I talk about what I call first generation fast food, which emerges very early 1900s. Like White Castle is 1920. So it's actually the first burger chain. People assume it's McDonald's, it's not. And all the first generation restaurants were urban, still in white space, but all in urban areas. And they were very sort of basic, no frills, kind of fuel for the working man was there, and the whiteness of White Castle and these other places, all this white tile was functioning to be a marker for hygiene. And because there was a lot of concerns about food safety at the time and so on. So this was a place to know that you could eat a burger and be safe and, you'd be all right, essentially. But then second generation fast food comes around in the 1950s and it's in the suburbs. So it's no longer just fuel, it's fun, right? And it's about the calm and wholesome domestic white space of the suburbs. It's a place for kids and for moms and families, and, all of that. So that's first and second generation. And then you could argue that some of these new restaurants like Shake Shack or maybe a third generation, which aren't actually necessarily so much a new iteration as a kind of looking back at the prior one. Shake Shack is not, it's kind of like an amped up version of the second generation. Like they call themselves, I forget quite the phrasing, but it's something like, making reference to the roadside restaurant of yore. And it's just, but it's more for now, kind of a white urban affluence that's returning to cities. It's not cheap. It's not meant to be like a low price point product. It's not just about convenience, or something. So it's a new iteration. And Slutty Vegan is, obviously as a Black owned concern owned by Black women, like that's also a new, it's new, but also not new in as much as, I don't think she franchises her restaurants. So, and in the 60s, there were Black franchisors who developed their own franchise system. So it's not that it's new for Black people to be at the head of a fast food restaurant, but clearly a vegan fast food, Black owned, that's new. So it does seem like there are lots of different kind of iterations. I'm sorry?
Sorry, I was just saying the respectability thing too is really interesting. Putting sex forward. Also, and thinking about the chapter Freedom from Panic around gender and sexuality. True. Is a new kind of take on it.
Yeah. So I don't know if I can say confidently where I think is going to go, but I feel like it seems like there are multiple avenues that are likely to take unexpected forms. And just the idea too about health, like Slutty Vegan is pretty unapologetic that this isn't, you're not going there for your health food. This is purely just for the deliciousness and to enjoy. And which is also really interesting because this is something that I don't remember if I point out in the book. I think I do. But the idea that food, like fast food as food, rarely even comes up in this history. Like no one, at no point are you reading people saying like, this food is so delicious. And we would enjoy eating this food. And that's the reason why we want these restaurants. And so like the only time you see Black people agitating for access to fast food is because it's a financial instrument. It's for franchise, for wealth accrual, for community development, like the idea of fast food as food. It was not really.
That's so interesting. Even the Mahalia Jackson, the soul food, fast food, which tried to kind of meld those two with like a chicken gizzards, a soul bowl.
The soul bowl, right.
Right. Trying to infuse that tradition back into it. But one of my questions I always sit with is fast food an American food tradition? Or is it, as you say in the book, like an Anglo bland, or have preferences, combinations, augmentations to your fast food developed for tradition, in terms of like a cultural knowledge? Again, I could do this all day, and I try not to question here, because I see a question from Theo as well that says, how did you come up with the title? So either or both. Is it food, African-American food tradition, and how did you come up with the title?
Well, okay, so let me do the title first. The title, actually, I can't even tell you how many iterations of title there were. The first, what was the first title? It was like, actually the very first title, the first title that I submitted to the press, when I submitted, so basically, for those that don't know, when you're submitting a book to an academic, press, a university press, one of the core parts of the process is peer review. So you're developing this manuscript, and it has to get sent out to other scholars who review it, say, these ideas aren't developed so well, or what about this, or have you considered that? And they help you to strengthen the project. So when I sent the proposal for the book out, or sent it to the press when it was going to go out for peer review, my working title at that time was Paint It Black. What was the subtitle? Race and the Transformation of Fast Food in America, or Race and the Transformation of the American Meal, something like that. So that was the working title. And of course, the peer reviewers had feedback about that. They didn't love it so much. Okay, no problem. And then when it came back, I started working on new titles. And then by the time it went into production, or when it's like going to copy edit, I think, I forget at what point it is. Anyway, I was trying to, at that point, the marketing department is chiming in, and they're giving their feedback like, well, this title or that, we think it will work better. It'll appeal to more readers. It'll, you want to try to bring in as many people to be interested, and so on. So I went through several, and then finally one day it just sort of hit me. I was playing with different things and it was like boom, and it just, yeah, it came from the heavens. I don't know. So, and then what was the other question again? I forgot.
Is fast food an African American food tradition?
Oh, well, I would say, so fast food is really interesting because it's like, it kind of is kind of like a chameleon for, I don't know, is that the thing I want to say? Like, because it can change, depending on context. On the one, and it gets invested with a lot of stuff, but I do think it purports to be, and has all this iconography of being the closest thing to the American national meal, if there is one. Cuisine is supposed to be local and founded on things that are specific. There's no just, even like French cuisine, like French cuisine is regional. I mean, you have to think about where and what place, what kinds of particular foods, the way they cook this or that, any place you're talking about. So there's that, but it definitely, I think it stands in for America, certainly abroad when you think of it that way. And so even at the beginning though of this history where Black people were utterly excluded from, say, the first generation of restaurants, it's not like first of all, nobody was worried about that. Nobody was studying fast food to be upset like we don't have White Castle in our neighborhood. But, and in any case, they are also, Black people also developing their own little, just because at the end of the day, those are just little outlets to go grab something to eat. And of course, we had plenty of those in our own neighborhoods as well. So there were always going to be takes on that. You know what I mean? So I would say it can be, because it can slot into so many different ways of thinking about food. But I think the way it gets projected is with an aura of Americana, which of course always gets read as white.
Yeah, and I think, one of the many strengths of the book is understanding that this is African American community and social fabrics and how they've been targeted, divested from, right? So it's not just about, is it a tradition? Is it a cuisine? We're looking at what are the social implications of removing a safe place, a place where you have dignity conferred upon you when you go, when you leave, when you stay. And so for those of you thinking it's just about the taste and the meat and bashing obesity and all that, it's really about one of these crucial spaces where we need to think about the African American community and the challenges with understanding them as American, fully American, and belonging and citizenship and rights and all of that.
Right.
So I see we're at time. If there are Q&As or follow-ups or questions, I don't know, Allison, if you want to, and the link to the book, of course, everyone buy the book, this one, and also Burgers and Blackface. And thank you for your time and conversation.
Thank you so much, everyone. And I'm so glad you came in and stuck with it while I was being absent-minded professor, but
guilty.
It means a lot to be here.
Thank you both so much. I just want to show this book that just came out on the April 25th, and it's called Sam and the Incredible African and African American Food Fight. So maybe this will be the next one in our series. I don't know. But it's a beautiful picture book, also from University of Minnesota, I believe.
Yeah.
So we're very grateful for this contribution to our history and to our thinking about food and fast food. We did have that little conversation earlier, but we were only enriched, by the conversation. And thank you for everyone that's hanging in there after 7:02 right now. But if there were any other questions, we could maybe take them now. And just to let you know, the link is in the chat, and the White Burgers Black Cash is available at Source Booksellers in store and at Source Booksellers online. But thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, and for Jessica for being the discussant. And yeah, I appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Any last words? You said just thank you.
Any last words? That I can think of at the moment.
So mine would be to follow for any more information on the book or your future research. It's on Black Cash
White Burgers Black Cash. See, you're better promoting my whiteburgersblackcash.com, a companion website. Yes, and you can see links to reviews. There's a gallery, so you can see a lot more photos than even appear in the book, and there's a bunch of stuff on there. So check that out as well.
Awesome. All right, thank you so much. To you both, have a wonderful evening.
Good night.
Thank you.